What you're watching right now is a seminar that has been prepared by the group for a world without racism. This is a group of Bulgarian speaking folks who are interested in what we can do to make things a little bit better for our lives. What we're talking about today is anti-Semitism. We're gonna do a an hour and a half session in English with Jonathan from If Not Now, and then we're going to have a panel in Bulgarian where we're going to have Angel and Solomon, Stoyo, Milena, and Deliana. So we have a couple of participants in the Zoom, but our main speaker right now is Jonathan Horowitz. Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, Nina.
Hi. Jonathan is an educator and a debate coach. He is joining us with the movement If Not Now. If Not Now, most of you may be familiar, or at least those who are interested in this sort of thing, but this is a movement to change the American Jewish community and the occupation in Israel, Palestine. And we are very lucky to have Jonathan here. He has done a lot of these seminars, and he will be walking us through like a presentation he prepared for us. And I'm incredibly excited for this opportunity because it is one of a kind. So Jonathan, with that, it's all you.
All right. Thank you so much, Nina. I'm also very excited. So let's get started. Yes, it should work. There we go. So everybody, like you said, I'm Jonathan. I'm really excited to meet everyone and talk to everybody. One of the things that's going to be happening throughout the presentation is there are going to be slides that just say questions. So whenever those happen, please ask questions, or before them, you can always write questions in the chat. If you're on the Zoom, you can put them in the chat box of the Zoom. If you're on the Facebook live stream, you can put them in the live stream, and I'd be more than happy to answer them. So a couple of ground rules before we get started. First thing to note is that we need to acknowledge and celebrate difference in the Zoom, I guess. So all of us are bringing many identities, cultures, experiences. And what's important is that we need to speak from our own experience. And we want to use I statements. So avoid saying things like Jews do X or everyone knows Y or any assumption about others. Just talk about your own experience so we can make this an inclusive space for everybody. The second thing is be open or do it for your neighbor. Take in what you like, and there are some things that might not be for you or might not work for you, but it might work for the person who's another person here. And be open to questions. This is a very complex topic, and we won't, at the end of today, we will not feel like we've resolved everything. We'll feel like we resolved some things, but like we're not gonna solve anti-Semitism in a day. But understanding it is still really important, and we can still do that. The final thing is give the benefit of the doubt. This is heavy stuff, and we're all here to grow together and learn together. And let's assume best intentions. So if there's something that comes off as mean-spirited to you or whatever, just give the benefit of the doubt. They're here for a reason. You're either taking your Sunday evenings or Sunday mornings, or wherever you are in the world, to learn about this stuff. Let's assume that there's a benefit of the doubt. The other thing that's important to note in terms of questions is let's not talk about Zionism or Israel until I bring it up. I promise you we will talk about it. It's a very important thing to talk about, but there's a bunch of work that we need to do before we get there. So just don't when I'm asking a question and I haven't brought up like Zionism or Israel, don't like start just understand that we're going to build to it. All right. So before we talk about anti-Semitism, we have to talk about Jews. And we have to talk about who are Jews. And Jews are an ethno-religious group, which means that Judaism is both an ethnicity and a religion. So the thing is that people try to think of Judaism as sort of being a Christianity, but without Jesus, but it's very much different in two major ways. One is Judaism, the religion, is based on observance and not based on faith. And the second thing is that Judaism historically is more about ethnicity than religion. So like I have a lot of friends who don't do anything Jewish in the religious sense, but all identify as Jews because they're ethnically Jews and their parents were Jews. And that is a meaningful identity to them in a way that it doesn't make sense to sort of, if you're not do anything like Christian, you're probably not going to call yourself a Christian. There also means that there are many different types of Jews in the world, and there are many different streams of Judaism. There are Jews that anywhere from humanist Jews, which are basically Jews who do the observances but literally don't believe in God, to Jews in or to ultra Orthodox Jews, like the people you see wear like the black hats and what are called payas, the things around their ears, who try to live what they believe to be like the most they believe to be like the correct form of Judaism. And there's many different theological and other disagreements, but Jews are united by mostly a shared belief system, and more importantly, a common history of oppression and being put away and other things about our history. The other thing to note about Jews is that there are many different Jewish identities. Not all Jews are white. So there are Ashkenazi Jews like myself, who you mostly see for a variety of reasons, who are descendants of Jews from Eastern Europe. So that means Jews from like Russia, Poland, the Baltics, like Lithuania, Latvia, those sorts of places. Then you have Sephardic Jews, like Violeta Yakova. She's a Bulgarian Jew and a very famous anti-fascist, who are the descendants of Jews from Spain. The Spanish Jewish community was the largest Jewish community for about 600 years, and then they were kicked out under Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. And so the Spanish Jews kind of moved across a lot of the Mediterranean, mostly into what was Ottoman territory. So a lot of Sephardic Jews sort of lived in Turkey. Bulgaria had a large population of Sephardic Jews as well, a few other sort of places. Then you have Mizrahi Jews, like Isaac Mizrahi, who's a fashion designer, who are descendants of Jews from the Middle East. And that's Jews, like, after Jews were originally kicked out by the Romans, they all moved to various places that weren't quite like Palestine. So you have Syria, like Syrian Jews, Jordanian Jews, Lebanese Jews, Egyptian Jews, like anywhere sort of in the Middle East, North Africa, Moroccans, Iraqi Jews. Then you have things like Ethiopian Jews who come from Ethiopia, right? And they're very like, so the Mizrahi Jews like are basically Arab Jews in a sense. That's a very complicated ethnic distinction. There are Ethiopian Jews who are Black Jews. You have like Jews from India who came, apparently, the story is they came with Alexander the Great in trading routes. And there are Indian Jews, there are Chinese Jews, the Kaifeng Jews. So there are Jews basically everywhere with a lot of different sort of ethnic backgrounds. So the idea of the Jew looking exactly like me is false. So I have a question for people. How many Jews do you think there are in the world? Anybody think that they have an answer? And Nina, you can look in the chat for people.
Yes, I do have to say the way that Facebook works, it's like just a few seconds later after we record. So there's a little bit of a lag. So let's see if folks know how many Jews are there in the world currently. Let me say, I'm guessing it's probably more than Bulgarians, but not that much more. My guess in the head would be about 10 million.
Yes, my guess is between 10 and 20 million.
Between
10 and 20?
10 and 20 million.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that's actually a pretty good guess. It's about 15 million Jews in the world today. So yeah, between 10 and 20 is exactly on the nose. So that means that Jews make up approximately like 0.2% of the world's population. So for all the things that I'm talking about, right, there are just not that many Jews in the world. For the amount that Jews are sort of talked about as the root, like of roots and things like that. Like there just really are not that many Jews. And Jews make up about 1% of the population of the United States, which is the second most of any country. Israel, obviously, Jews make up somewhere between 50 and 52% of the population of Israel, Palestine, but they only make up about 1% of the population of the US, and that's like the second most of any country. So for the most part, if most Jews right now, post World War II, live in either the US or Israel, and then like you just sort of have smatterings in various other countries. Any questions so far?
So this is interesting, Jonathan. I think, can I ask you, why did you put in this question? Like, do you feel like most people think it's more, or do you feel like most people think it's less? Like, I'm assuming you put this question for a reason.
From what I understand, a lot of people tend to miscalculate the numbers, like very badly, in terms of thinking that there are sort of a lot more Jews, particularly because people think there are a lot more Jews, so it's important to understand the numbers. And if you don't understand the numbers, then
the scope is unclear. You know, this is really interesting, and I kind of want to make a parallel to us as Bulgarians, because so I'm a Bulgarian immigrant in the US, and interestingly enough, pretty much everyone I meet has a Bulgarian friend, a best Bulgarian friend. So people tend to think that there's like a lot more Bulgarians in the world than there really are, for one or another reason. And I think that this is similar to Jewish folks.
Yeah, I would agree with something like that. Absolutely. So, so now let's get into anti-Semitism. This is a definition that, if not now, uses to define anti-Semitism. So originating in European Christianity, anti-Semitism is the form of ideological oppression that targets Jews. Like all oppression, the ideology contains elements of dehumanization and degradation via lies and stereotypes about Jews, as well as mythology. The myth changes and adapts to different times and different places, but fundamentally it says that Jews are to blame for society's problems. Once this mythology was established, it follows Jews throughout Europe and was exported to the Middle East, North Africa, and the Americas through colonialism and imperial conquest. So that's a lot. But the fundamental thing to understand is that Jews are to blame for society's problems, and that Jews are sort of the person behind the person. So they're the ones pulling the strings. As I've heard it described in other places, anti-Semitism is sort of an all-purpose conspiracy theory. So is the world going the way I want it to? No, well, it's the Jews' fault, because they're controlling things. And that's what's things like the vast worldwide Jewish conspiracy and things like that. And that's the sort of beginning of anti-Semitism. So a couple of things to note about this definition is that it focuses on Ashkenazi Jews in particular. And the experiences of Mizrahi Jews, Ethiopian Jews, and other Jews are very different. So just as an example, Ethiopian Jews are also have the additional thing of being Black in a world that is white supremacist, in a world that's racist. And so not only do they have to deal with the anti-Semitism stuff, they also have to deal with all the racism that comes from being Black as well. And so those experiences are different. I can't speak to those experiences as well, obviously, but it's important to point out because the experiences, the way that it works is very different. And the other thing just to point out is that most Bulgarian Jews, from the research that I did, seem to be not Ashkenazi. They seem to be either Mizrahi, so like from the Middle East historically, Sephardi, which is from Spain, or Romaniot, which is Jews who were exiled in the Roman Empire and moved sort of across Europe. Most Romaniots became Greek Jews, but that's not necessarily true that all Romaniots are Greek. There were some Ashkenazi Jews, but for the most part, it was sort of those. ethnically speaking, which I think is really cool. The Romania Jews, I think, are very, very cool. The other thing to note about anti-Semitism is that it's a cyclical, it moves in cycles. And the cycle goes like this. Jews are isolated from other groups, particularly other oppressed groups in their countries. Oppressed groups are then trained to focus their anger on Jews. And when oppressed groups get angry and revolt, the Jews are blamed. And Jews attempt to break this cycle by cooperating with the rulers or the ruling ideology. So the idea is that Jews and other oppressed groups, most notably economic oppression, so like peasants and stuff, are separated and isolated from those groups and are not able to be in solidarity with them. And the oppressed groups focus their anger on Jews instead of focusing on the source of their oppression. And so they get angry and revolt, and they revolt at the Jews instead of where the root of their oppression. And Jews, basically, because they feel isolated from those oppressed groups, what they try to do is they say, if we cooperate with the authorities, we cooperate with the ruling ideology, they'll keep us safe, and we won't have to worry about these oppressed groups coming and getting to us. So I'm trying to, what I don't remember. Great, okay. So a really good example is a really old example that they talk about is tax collection. So Jews were like tax collectors or merchants. And we're gonna get into this when we talk about in like a few minutes, but I want to like use it now on the cycle as sort of a starting point. So Jews were like tax collectors, and so peasants would train and focus their and they would be isolated from the peasants because they wouldn't be peasants, they would be tax collectors. And whenever the Lord raised their taxes, the oppressed groups would be told, oh, it's the greedy Jews doing the tax collecting, not my Lord who raised their taxes. The oppressed groups would get angry, burn down the Jewish homes, but the Lord would still be able to have the same taxes. And the way the Jews try to break it is like, hey, Lord, we're being really good tax collectors. Help us, help us, help us. And the Lord's like, I am. And, they're still burning down their houses. So, any questions?
Oh, this is really good stuff. Thank you, Jonathan. We are waiting for questions from folks. And while we do that, I kind of want to ask a few things, if you don't mind.
No, please go for it.
So one thing that it was, and I want to bring you back to how many Jewish people are there and what type of Jewish people are there. One of the things that was always incredibly hard for me to understand is whether Jewish folks are, whether this is like something that is related to religion or to genetics. So I don't know if you can speak a little bit about that.
The answer is both. That's the ethnicity and religion part. So part of it about Jews being isolated, there are sort of two things that happen. One is through deliberate government policy, and the other one is through cultural custom. Jews have tended to marry internal as compared to external. And because Jews have married sort of internally, there are actually genetic traits that are specific to Jews. So for example, there are like the 12 tribes of Israel, there are things that they're Kohanim, like the Cohens, the priests, and Leviim, who are the priest helpers. They can actually, in the DNA, because of however marriage patterns work, in the DNA, you can actually see there's like a Cohen DNA strand that only exists in Jewish Kohanim. So very clearly there's some sort of genetic component to that. But it's also like a question of religion as well. So they're like, you can join, you can convert, and that would make you Jewish. So it's a question of how, like, both. And the big thing to understand is that it's the question of identity is a question of not necessarily religious identity. It can also be a question of ethnic identity as much as it is religious identity. So there are people who identify as Jewish because they like Jewish humor and bagels and things like that. There are people who identify as Jewish because they go to synagogue every week and do all of the rituals. The other thing to note, I guess, that's important is that Judaism is because it's an observance-based religion, has a lot of observances that exist throughout the time, and like throughout the year. And so even people who would call themselves like non-observant still do a lot because there's just a lot. So somebody who might call themselves a non-observant Jew might have Friday night dinner every week, which is a traditional Jewish practice, might celebrate all of the major holidays, of which there are like 6 in various capacities, will go to, services like 3 times a year, which I guess is similar to Christianity, but like even that would be considered a lot. So that can still sort of change.
Awesome. This was actually really helpful. So it is both. The other thing is we do have a question here from the chat. And I think that if you can do a little bit more to elaborate on the tax collection piece that you mentioned earlier. So you did say that the Jewish folks were tax collectors. I think that some of us have already heard that tax collection wasn't necessarily a choice. This was by law because of some restrictions on owning land and things like that. So if you don't mind just elaborating a little bit more on this.
Yeah.
For instance,
yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I do want to elaborate on it, but what I'm going to do is I'm about to, on the next part of the presentation, is going to talk about that. So why don't we get to that, and then I think that that'll actually answer the tax collection question. And if it doesn't, then I can elaborate on more specifically.
Awesome, this is perfect.
Yeah. So, oh, okay, a little bit further in. Sorry, what I don't remember is I put this together on Friday, and I know where I'm going, but I don't really remember in what specific order all the time. So let's go to tax collection, and then we'll come back to today's moment for a second. So the understanding of Jews is as middle agents, and there's a thing called middle agent theory. And middle agent theory is that Jews have sort of been upwardly mobile people in sort of the middle, so like teachers, doctors, social workers, landlords, and roles that oppress others between themselves and the owning class. And a lot of that was by law, and then it's sort of become by custom. So the idea is that Jews, we're not allowed to own land, and we're only allowed to work in certain professions. And because they could not own land and only work in certain professions, they were put into specific roles, generally like merchants, tax collectors, and other sort of small shop owner type roles. And they would become they could become very wealthy from that and could be very good, but they were still acting as sort of middle agents between the oppressed peasants and the lords who actually owned like land and armies and things like that. And so they were always in a somewhat precarious position, hoping for the Lord's protection. Also, they were law saying, Jews couldn't own weapons, Jews couldn't raise armies, and things like that. And so they never had the means to defend themselves when they were attacked. And so we're stuck when like sort of attacks did happen and violence did happen. They really could not defend themselves. So that also sort of contributed to a lot of the hatred. So yeah, actually that is a very good question. So let's move sort of from there sort of to today's moment for a sec. So today, the ruling ideology is white supremacy, right? And so the way we live in a system and in a society where where everybody, right, where white people sort of rule the world, white broadly expanded, and so Jews, and this is particularly true in the United States, and so Jews are attempting to be white. So in the 1950s in the United States, right, Jews made a bargain, and the bargain was instead of being Jewish, we're going to be white folks. And they moved out to the suburbs. They took big upper class jobs, and tried to sort of become white. The idea was like, we're just like our white Christian neighbors, except we pray on Saturday instead of on Sunday. Isn't that great? And so that belief is exactly similar to how Jews have done it before, right? So if we're white, that means we're isolated from other oppressed groups, right? We're not working with them. We're not, and that means that oppressed groups sort of see us as an oppressor. We're working within the dominant ideology, much like we were before, and and the other thing that we're doing is we're not explaining right? And then the other thing is we're taking these roles that happen to be in the middle. So, so for example, right now, we take stereotypical professions of like doctors, lawyers, accountants, etc. And these professions are not people who own things, but people who manage things for those who own things, right? So like a lawyer helps legally the people who own things be able to own things. Accountants make sure that people who own things are able to use their money properly. Doctors make sure that people are healthy, which is a middle role between, right? You need everybody as a doctor. And so they're a middle role between like the actual owners of like, let's say the hospital and the sick people who actually need to use the hospital. And so then we become the middle agents between the owners of capital and the workers of capital. The other good example actually is landlords. If you look at where Jews are landlords, it tends to be in poorer or minority communities in the United States. Why are Jews like the #1 owners of land in like Harlem? Because all of the good white areas were already owned by like WASPs. So when Jews wanted to become landlords, they were left with only Black majority neighborhoods. So they started owning buildings in Harlem or other sort of majority non-white neighborhoods. And that, again, puts us in the middle where we're between those who are oppressed and the owning class, and we're not, right, and it's not there. The other thing, I guess, that's important to note here about anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism makes it look like Jews have power or money. Because as much as owners, doctors and lawyers and accountants are still in the middle, you can still be very wealthy and very successful being a doctor. You can make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. A lawyer makes hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Accountants can make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So being in these professions, even if they're managerial, they still involve a lot of education. They still involve they still are very good professions to be in economically and under capitalism. So it looks like Jews have a lot of success. And this is also played out in a bunch of different places because being the middle agent, right, being a merchant, you can become fabulously wealthy. Being a tax collector, you can become very wealthy. Like these professions are not professions of poverty, they're professions of the upper middle class. And so Jews historically, before we had a term like upper middle class, were in those sorts of professions and were doing very well. So it seemed like, oh, hey, like the Jews had a problem. And now look, they're doing so well. And that looks like the problem has gone away because anti-Semitism allows for that sort of success.
Jonathan, yeah. I will pause you for a second. I think we do have a little bit of
let's do it.
No, I don't think we have, we do have questions, but before we get to the questions, I think we have a little bit of trouble. The feed has stopped on Facebook. So let me just make sure that it's kicked people off. So I want to see if we're back on before we move on. A little bit of,
let's do it.
No, I don't think we have, we do have questions, but before I think we may be back. Okay, I think folks see us right now. All right, perfect. So let me just go straight into the questions here. It really resonated with me, I should say, what you said about Jewish folks and their managerial positions nowadays. And it is true, I am actually in one of those positions, and I have a lot of colleagues that are in this field that are Jewish. And I do think that because in academia and other areas there are a lot of Jewish folks, and there has been this push for understanding whiteness as Jewish folks being white. One of the comments that we had received in the very beginning of the discussions in our group was someone came around and said, "Oh no, don't, we don't worry about anti-Semitism because Jewish folks are white." And we thought that, in an anti-racist group, essentially, that's not how we want to approach things. And oftentimes when we talk about anti-racism, it's more about let's integrate. And I think that when it comes to anti-Semitism, that's one of the best examples where integration is not it shouldn't be the only thing as a solution. And I think that comes around to what you had said about cyclicality. Not sure if you want to respond to this before I move on to some of the other questions.
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. It can't always be integration, because part of it is there's also a little bit of difference that just is going to exist, and accepting that is okay. So you're never gonna totally assimilate all the other things just because people's experiences and ideologies are not going to be able to be assimilated in the same way. So yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let me get to some of the questions.
Solomon, looks like you have a question.
I do have a comment, and I would like to say that stressing on tax collecting is I would say quite unfair, because knowing my community and maybe we have to, and probably in the second part we will do more about Bulgaria, but tax collecting wasn't at all the main occupation of the Jews living on
Correct.
the Balkans.
Right.
So this is quite
right. So Solomon, this is exactly why I said that the experience, when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about it in terms of Ashkenazi experiences and not Sephardi, Mizrahi, and other experiences, specifically because of the fact that things were different in the Balkans and in the Ottoman Empire and in places like Bulgaria.
Absolutely.
Because the way in which this played out in those other places was different, is particularly in the Middle Ages, because a lot of this has to do with like Western European, and I would say even in some ways like Russian versions of feudalism that never happened in Bulgaria, because Bulgaria didn't have those experiences in the same way.
Sure. And so secondly, I would like to make the point that when we talk about our area, racism at the time when Jews were here, and we can prove that Jews were here before the Bulgarians. I mean, in these lands, that was not the question at the time, and there was no such I would say problem. The problem in our areas was between the two major religions, Christians and Muslims. And Jews played a very specific role in this, I would say, sometimes difficult, sometimes not so difficult relations.
Right, I would definitely agree with that. And I think that's something to note there, is that it's different in different places. But part of the definition that I said originally was like this definition got exported. And so that original definition of anti-Semitism talks about, like, when I say originated in European Christianity, it's really like, I would say even more specifically, like Catholicism as compared to Orthodoxy. And the reason why I say that specifically is because those definitions sort of got exported out from those notions. And so the way that, like, the way anti-Semitism looks like today is not necessarily the way that it played out in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in a lot of places. But because of the nature of European colonialism, and specifically Western European colonialism, and the ideas that were there, it moved. And you can see this very clearly in the Arab world. Like the way that Arab anti-Semitism works today is very similar to European anti-Semitism, whereas historically that was not the case. And I think that that's sort of, it's important to understand that, like, what I'm talking about is where the definition works now and the way that it works now. But just because it is the way that it works now, which is why I'm focusing on it, does not mean that it was necessarily that way in all places at all times, and that it always did it the exact same way in all places at all times. But because of other historical factors that are well beyond the Jews' control, like it became it works in this way now. And that is important to note. But I do appreciate you saying, like, hey, you know, this didn't necessarily work this way then in Bulgaria, which I think is absolutely true. So with that, let's actually talk about the impacts of anti-Semitism.
Actually, can I just interrupt you a little bit?
Yeah.
We do have some comments here in the chat box that unfortunately you can't see everything, but I think exactly what Solomon and you said, Jonathan, folks have some comments around the history within the Ottoman Empire. And one of the things that Asya is bringing up here that's really interesting is about the fact that Jewish folks were actually holding some positions as translators, which was a very influential position. I think the term is dragoman, if I am saying this correctly. Is this ringing a bell for any of you?
I unfortunately do not know much about the internal politics of the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, and then so Asya is mentioning, so we will keep in mind that you may not be too familiar with this. We're actually planning on having another seminar with someone who has done a lot of research in that area.
But something that I do want to point out about translator that I think is really interesting is translator is the perfect example of a middle agent, right? There's somebody who's in between those with authority and those without authority.
And that's what Asya is saying too. So this is like straight into what she's saying.
Yeah.
So about NCAAP, is that something anyone's familiar with?
There's the NAACP, which is a Black civil rights organization that was founded by Jews and Blacks at the beginning of the 20th century, and is still around. We can talk about that, but that
awesome
is a very interesting. There is overlap there, and there's a question of American Jews in particular have moved a lot politically in a lot of ways, and that is a very complicated story in and of itself. But like, let's hold off on that for right a second. So the impact of anti-Semitism today is that, right, first off, Jews are not seen as an oppressed group, right? We're seen as sort of white, or, you know, not as part of it, like it happened in the past. And this is true historically as well, right? So like a lot of the ways people see Jews now is like, yeah, the Holocaust happened, but after the Holocaust, they got Israel, and then they became all these successful doctors and lawyers, so they're no longer oppressed. And it's the same thing, but the same thing was true in Spain. Oh, the Jews were kicked out of Spain, but now they're in the Ottoman Empire and they're doing really well, like they're translators and stuff, so they're no longer oppressed. And the same thing was true in Germany in the 1920s. Yeah, the Jews used to have it super bad, but now look at modern Germany, like they're fine. And so that's something that happens like as part of the cycle. When the cycle's at a low ebb where Jews are not being attacked as much, they're sort of not being seen as oppressed. And so, right, people don't see the true oppressive sectors, but see Jews as pulling the strings. So people get angry at Jews and not the people in power. And specifically bringing it to us is that it means that anti-Semitism is inherent to white supremacy, because white supremacists and white nationalists, like the far right of the people who are white supremacists, say that Jews are the ones pulling the strings, because to them, right, like people of color could never, like Martin Luther King could never exist by himself, because people of color literally cannot be that smart. They couldn't be smarter than white people. So the only way that it's possible for it to happen is because Jews were controlling Martin Luther King and like the Black Civil Rights Movement to create the equality that like happened in the United States and the revolution that happened. And obviously that's all BS. But the idea then is that you can't separate like the white supremacist ideology from anti-Semitism. And that is very important because that sort of piece rests on a lot of ideological pillars, which means that, you know, being able to understand it and being able to kick it out means that we can really force it through in a way that's useful. So here's a good diagram again of like sort of the middle agent theory, right? So you have the owning class, white, Gentile. Gentile is a term that just means non-Jewish. It's not necessarily offensive. Many Jews have been upwardly mobile, and then you have sort of the working class. So, right, again, the middle agent theory. And the other thing there is that anti-Semitism also was an escape hatch for those in power to continue their oppression. And it still works that way today. Because if the Jews are burning down, if they're burning down the Jewish homes of the tax collector, that means they're not going to the Lord to kill the Lord. And that is very important today, because if you think the Jews are the ones in charge who are pulling the strings, then you're not actually going to the people in power who can do a lot of this stuff, and they're just stuck. And so that's something that I particularly like thinking about in terms of the escape hatch. So the thing that comes after that is anti-Semitic confusion. And everybody's confused about anti-Semitism because it gets thrown at all sides. They were during the Ukrainian Civil War a few years ago, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whatever. You had both sides were accusing the other side of anti-Semitism. So the Ukrainians were accusing the Russians of anti-Semitism. The Russians were accusing Ukrainians of anti-Semitism, right? And so everybody's able, people like to claim it and confuse it and use it to sort of further their own ends. And part of what perpetuates anti-Semitism is the fact that people are confused about what anti-Semitism is, how anti-Semitism functions, and what's going on. So I wanted to name the parts of anti-Semitism and explain why people are confused on anti-Semitism. And when I say people, I include Jews in this too. Like I think Jews, a lot of Jews are also confused as to what anti-Semitism is or how it functions. And so understanding that confusion, I think, is important. Also, for this section specifically, I want to thank Sherry Brown, who has been doing this work since the 80s, doing a lot of Jewish consciousness raising work and anti-Semitism work. And I went to a seminar by her a few years ago, and it was really useful in sort of compiling this list. So the first reason why we're confused is anti-Semitism is systematically denied, right? And I've heard this sort of happened in this group, and it's happened in other places, right? Jews are successful. It happened in the past, but not now. Like it's not a thing anymore.
Exactly.
And so it means that we're not like, people are like, okay, whatever. And so we don't think about it because we don't actually have the words to talk about it. The second thing is that anti-Semitism is not on the laundry list of oppressions. So when you're talking about an inclusive space or an anti-racist space, right, you'll say, we need to stop racism and sexism and homophobia and Islamophobia and ableism, right? And you'll sort of make a list in your head because that's what people do. And so anti-Semitism doesn't make it onto that list because it's not thought about, which means that it's not something that is consciously brought into spaces where a lot of anti-racist work comes in. And so a lot of the work that people have done on sort of these other oppressions just isn't done on anti-Semitism because it doesn't make the list, so it doesn't do the work. The other thing that part of that is because so much of this is that grades of mistreatment in anti-Semitism don't exist. Either the Holocaust is literally occurring, like people are literally in concentration camps, or there's nothing. Like the idea of a microaggression, an anti-Semitic microaggression, isn't something that people talk about because it's just because it's not on the laundry list and people don't think about it in terms of those microaggressions and how people don't think about how they could accidentally be perpetuating anti-Semitism, which also, by the way, is part of with number 1 as well. Then the other thing is number 3, which is there's anti-Semitism without people knowing you're a Jew. So Jews have responded to anti-Semitism in a lot of ways. And there's here's my chart of Ashkenazi Jews' internalized anti-Semitism responses. You don't need to read it. It is very much about sort of Jewish stuff, but like a couple of notable traits is that Jews tend to be very anxious, and Jews tend to strive for perfection. Anxious because we're like worried, and then strive for perfection because if we're perfect, then maybe we won't be killed. And so people sometimes get very annoyed at some of the traits Jews show. And so they like hate, they say like, well, I just don't like that person. And it's not because they're Jewish, but it's because they're showing Jewish traits, which is really hard sometimes it's really hard, but like that can happen. The fourth thing, is that there is no ally movement. So most other oppressions have some sort of ally movement that exists somewhere. So for example, right, none of y'all are, as far as I know, none of y'all are like Roma, but you do, just in my like 3 days on the Facebook group, I've seen a lot of stuff trying to help the Roma in Bulgaria.
I should stop you here and just say that we do actually have Roma folks in our group who are Roma activists.
Oh, wonderful.
And we are allies, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's an ally movement to help the Roma in Bulgaria, right? And that's true in the United States as well. These examples are US specific, which is why I wanted to give a Bulgarian example as well. So you have Surge, which is Stand Up for Racial Justice, which is where white people in the United States go together to help racism. You have parents and friends of the organization who come together to work for that, but you don't sort of have that ally movement for anti-Semitism in various places. And because of the fact that you don't have those ally movements, it means that it also it increases Jews' isolation, but also like there aren't people outside of Jews really talking about it, really talking about anti-Semitism and thinking about anti-Semitism in any way that amounts to serious, that's in a sort of serious fashion. This is the first time where I've done it for a majority non-Jewish group, which is really cool, but also shows how rare it is. And then finally, it says that Jew is a dirty word. So under the Oxford English Dictionary, it calls it, right, Judaism, Jew is called, is one of the definitions is as a slur, like he Jewed me out of it. And I've used the word the whole presentation, and I describe myself as a Jew, and I don't think it's a dirty word, and a lot of Jews agree with me that it's not a dirty word. But the fact that we can't even like decide on whether what we call ourselves in general is a slur or not, and there's like a debate about it, indicates that there's a bunch of things that still need to be worked out just at the level of basic language that's problematic in a way that you don't with others. So right, like there's a question, right? It's not, we don't have a debate between whether we call people like black or the N-word. Like that's not a debate. Nobody talks about it that way, right? But with Jew, there's literally a question about whether it's a slur, and that creates a lot of confusion. So let's go there. Let's take some questions. I don't have a question slide, but I think it's time. So let's take some questions.
All right. First of all, I really would like to give us some credit for organizing this because, as you mentioned, Jonathan, this is probably unusual and kind of like one of a kind. We really wanted to address some of these things proactively rather than reactively, like most organizations and most movements actually do. You know, it's better to start talking about it early on and kind of like get on the same page and make sure that we are understanding how it all works. So kudos to us as a group for really being interested in this. Then we do have plenty of questions, Jonathan. Like, I think folks have been very engaged in this, finding this incredibly interesting. One of the things that folks want to hear more a little about is specifically the middle agent theory. And a very interesting question came up is how exactly we get from the middle agent theory to all of the conspiracy theories.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So to get from the middle agent theory to the conspiracy theory, so let me go back to the slide. So when you go back, it's the question of who is the face of power as compared to who is actually in power. So the idea here is, I'm going to use a tax collector example because I think it's illustrative in a lot of ways, is the peasant doesn't usually see the Lord because the Lord's sort of out there. But the peasant sees a tax collector every year. And so it's not the Lord who's truly in power, it's truly the tax collector, because that's sort of the face that they see. And you see that today. Who do we see who's in charge? It's not the owners of capital, it's the people who manage capital. So you have your, so the people who you see in power, who you see as part of sort of the power structure, are the sort of middle agents. They're not the actual owners. So if you look at these jobs here, teacher, doctor, lawyer, social worker, these are all jobs that involve meeting and talking to and being with a lot of people. They're not necessarily people in power, people who are very much not in power or do not have the ability for a variety of systemic reasons to get access to power. So what they see is their only view of seeing power is either like the president, that the president doesn't matter because he's all the way over there on the nightly news, or their sort of day-to-day interactions. And the day-to-day interactions are like with their doctor or with a teacher or with a lawyer, like their public defender if they're in prison or accused of a crime. And so it's like, so then who's really in charge? Oh, you know who's really in charge? It's the people I see every day. And the people I see every day are Jews. Ergo, it's really the Jews in power.
This is awesome. I think that you explained that really well. One of the other questions that is coming up is about, I think, more of a comment around the relationship with other oppressed groups. And I think that this was specifically the NAACP that you mentioned, or NAACP.
Yeah.
Then we do have a comment here from Danny about allyship. What he is mentioning, that part of the German anti-fascist or Antifa movement is definitely an ally movement, but that is probably specific to Germany.
Yeah, it definitely is specific to Germany. One thing that Germany has done a very good job of is talk about sort of the sordid parts of their history. And so a lot of the way that Germans do things are very much with, especially German leftists, very much with anti-Semitism in mind. But yeah, I would say that that's more of an exception on the world stage as compared to there. But even there, you have some very interesting things. So there's a increasingly growing Jewish community in Berlin, which is very interesting and very cool. And there's like a German Jewish history museum. And a few years ago, they literally had an exhibit where it was Ask a Jew, and they just put a Jew in a like info booth essentially. And they were just like, ask this person any questions. And obviously it was all volunteers, They didn't like force people to do it, but that got some things, that got some like type in the Jewish press of like, it's kind of weird and showy and exhibitionist in like a kind of weird way, but also like all the people who did it were like, it was great, it was really nice, people asked really good questions, and it was really cool to sort of share my culture with people. So there's, you still, I don't know. I find that story interesting, but like, yeah, I definitely agree about Germany, and I assume I would be very glad to know the German anti-fascists do a lot of that work.
Yeah, this is, it's funny because in America, a lot of people were waiting for Germany to save us from fascism this time around. So they've got a big, a big job to do. We have a comment here. I think it's more of a comment from Asia about a movie she's recommending from 1950s. It's Gentleman's Agreement. It is directed by Elia Kazan. Not sure if anyone has seen it, but this is a recommendation from Asia. And we do have another comment from Milena, who has a lot of experience in this sphere, but she's pretty much saying almost the same thing that you were mentioning, Jonathan, about the middle agent and how this is being in management positions. That's like translators of that power, and that's where these positions of change agents can be very dangerous.
Yeah. Something else I want to note, like about the American experience here, before we get into sort of the next thing, about the U.S., like Jews and everything else, is that the majority of Jews who came to the United States from Europe, from like the specifically from like Russia and Poland and the Baltics and things like that in the early 20th century, were communists, became communists, were very involved in sort of the communist movement, and were very much of the left. And as part of that, they did a lot of anti-racist work. And that's why you end up with organizations where the Jews sort of helped found things like the NAACP. And that was basically true through the 1950s and 1960s. And what happened were sort of two things simultaneously. The first thing is you have Joseph McCarthy. So for those of you who don't know, Joseph McCarthy was a US senator who was known for being an anti-communist, and he did like what amounted to an anti-communist crusade and just said, anybody he's like, I have a list of suspected communists and they should all be imprisoned. And for 2 years, it was very much a thing where they sort of hunted down, actually, no, I would say that's actually not in quotes, hunted down communists. And the communists that they found were mostly, were mostly Jews. And so a lot of Jews sort of stuck their heads underground who were leftists. And there was nobody there when they sort of popped back out again. And at the same time, Jews just participated in World War II and were wanted to sort of live the American dream. And so they started moving to the suburbs and started to try to become fully white and fully integrated into sort of American white society. And those two things created the isolation that was not as much the case in the early 20th century. But even that isn't entirely the story, because there are still a lot of Jews involved in the civil rights movement. If you've ever seen this film, Mississippi Burning, it's about the murder of two Jewish folks, Mickey Schwarber and I forget the other guy's name. But they were helping with the integration movement in Mississippi, and their cars were bombed. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a leader of the Masorti movement in Judaism, marched with Martin Luther King at Selma, and there were a lot of Jews sort of involved in the planning of that march. So there is still a lot of that work, but that work was not, but over time, it sort of, things became more and more separated for a variety of reasons. But yeah, there is a difference in that led to isolation. So it hasn't always been the case necessarily in the United States, but now I would say that it is more the case than it was particularly in the early 20th century. So The other thing about anti-Semitic confusion is that, unlike many other oppressions, people have really not spent as long in studying anti-Semitism in terms of how it functions, not in terms of its effects or its history. Like, there's a lot of history of like the history of the Jews and the history of anti-Semitism. There's a lot less on like how does the system of anti-Semitism function, and this is particularly true among Jews. And we're still figuring this stuff out, like as Jews. And also, Jews argue a lot. The joke is 2 Jews, 3 opinions. The other good joke is if there's a Jew on a deserted island and he built 2 synagogues, and people ask, why'd you build 2 synagogues? And he says, well, there's the one I go to and the one I never go to. You can't exist without the synagogue you don't go to, obviously. And so we're still figuring some of this stuff out. So sometimes you might be accused of something by one Jew that another Jew says is fine. Just give us space and assume best intentions, you know, and be like, okay, that's possible, but don't be like, you know, but also be aware that, you know, there's no like, all Jews agree this, because it's not true. And, you know, we're still figuring a lot of this stuff out in a way that I think a lot of other groups, they're still figuring it out too, but I think they're sort of further along the path than we are.
So I have to completely agree and reiterate to what you just said, Jonathan. As someone who is trying to be a good ally, one of the things that I am running into is the difference in opinion. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, I think that it's very normal and very healthy to have different opinions, and all we have to do is just continue to try and make our own decision. A lot of these questions that are coming and folks are having different opinions are actually just very much political questions, and it's completely normal for folks to have different opinions on them.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Yeah, and the other thing is that with the confusion and the muddling, it becomes hard. So it's hard to tell when something's anti-Semitic. I've been in situations where somebody said something anti-Semitic and I didn't realize until later. At some point, literally years later, like there's a conversation I had when I was coaching debate, and I didn't realize it until about 3 years later that, oh my God, that was really anti-Semitic. And it was just like, oh, wow. So, you know, this stuff is hard. I think we're good on questions. So let's go to Israel now, right? So now that we understand what anti-Semitism is and how anti-Semitism functions in general, we can start talking about anti-Semitism in a non-Israel context. Now we can start talking about it in the context of Israel. So the first thing you understand about Israel and anti-Semitism is Israel's the only majority Jewish country in the world. And if you criticize a Christian country, you criticize a Muslim country, you can always point out a counterexample that is not that country. And so at some point, it doesn't mean that you're criticizing. Like if I say the Saudi Arabian government is oppressive, you can point to other Muslim majority countries and say, well, yes, but the Tunisian government is not oppressive, or you know, another sort of Muslim majority country, to give sort of a counterexample if they're trying to use that to say, well, then all Muslims are oppressive or all Christian governments are oppressive. And you can't do that with Jews. There's only Israel. And what that means is that at some level, when people are criticizing Israel, they're criticizing, it can mean, not always, that there's like a point of like Jews in there. The other problem is that anti-Semitism exists. And criticizing Israel, particularly if you don't do it properly, can tap into a deeper well of anti-Semitism that exists in the world. But it's just the first thing to understand is that when you're criticizing Israel, there are those two things exist, and you can't really change them. You have to understand that in your criticism. That doesn't mean that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Trust me, I'm going to criticize Israel a lot. Most of my work, and if not now, is based upon criticizing Israel and the Israeli state for a whole bunch of reasons, because right now Israel is turning into a fascist country, which is awkward. And so we can't just like get rid of it, but we have to understand when we're talking about Israel that we are talking about both of these things. So the key in terms of this sort of critique is to critique policies and not people. So in other words, if you're going to criticize Israel, you have to say Israel is an occupying power that oppresses Palestinian rights, not Jews are an occupying people that oppress Palestinian rights, or Jews oppress Palestinians. Because if you do that, then you're tapping into sort of the deeper well of anti-Semitism. If you're talking about Israel, then you're talking about sort of the country. And that difference is important. The other thing I want to just point out here, and I put in a bullet point, the occupation is in fact really, really, really terrible. And all criticism of it is warranted. Yeah, so this is from, this is, I think, a good example of it. This is from a pamphlet by an author named April Rosenblum. It's called The Past Didn't Go Anywhere. And it's a really great pamphlet. I can't recommend it enough that you read it. I guess you can't.
Yes, me too. Thank you for recommending it. It's really amazing. I recommend it as well.
If you go, I have up over here, you can't really see. In my room, there's a bookshelf, and on the bookshelf, I have it up there because I end up returning to it like twice a year, which is a lot. And so as part of the pamphlet, it's also online. You can just search it up, but as part of it, it has this sort of chart. So we don't need to go through the whole chart, but I wanted to sort of show you what it looks like in terms of what ends up being good criticism and what ends up being bad criticism. So the first thing is, it's like, Israel has a repeated and ongoing record of human rights offenses. True and fair. Right, what ends up happening is people say Israel is the worst human rights violator or one of the worst human rights violators. And that leads to Nazis being able to say Israel is the root of all problems, is the root of the world's problems, which is very clearly anti-Semitic. So not being clear in your criticism means that you end up enabling Nazis to say the stuff that they want to say that we don't want them to say, that we don't want them to say and we don't want them to do. And that is particularly important in terms of making sure it's true. And the other thing here is that in general, sort of on the left, most owners of capital are rightists. And so the right uses money and like sort of inside influence to get change. The left uses people power and slogans, because when you're at a protest, you don't want to say the words, you don't want to use the third paragraph. Like, it's a paragraph. You don't want to say that at a protest because that's not a particularly good chant. So you end up with this one, right? Zionism is racism. We're going to get to Zionism in a second. And then you end up with the Zionist conspiracy. And so trying to figure out, trying to get yourself out of the mode of this is the worst and this is the chant is important because like getting yourself out of that mode because you end up enabling sort of the deeper well of anti-Semitism to flourish, and you end up empowering these anti-Semitic organizations. Something else, this is sort of general odds and ends involving Israel. So singling out Israel for criticism when plenty of other countries do the same thing seems like you are only yelling at Jews. And so people are very hesitant about that criticism. That doesn't mean that you can't criticize Israel again, but it does mean that, if you say something like Israel's the worst human rights violator, it's like, really? China's committing genocide right now. Uzbekistan has forced slavery. There's a bunch of other countries that are doing a bunch of other terrible stuff. And if you're only talking about Israel, it seems like you really only want to talk about the Jews, which is a problem. And potentially anti-Semitic, and I would say probably anti-Semitic actually. The other thing about it is dual loyalty, that that Jews are not technically loyal to the nation that they're from, but they're loyal to some sort of greater power, is a very long-standing anti-Semitic trope. So telling a Jew that they're an agent of Israel is anti-Semitic, because it's anti-Semitic because what you're saying is I'm not truly part of my country, I'm only part of some other country over there. So one of the ways that people would talk about anti-Semitism is they would say that, Jews are only loyal to other Jews, they're not loyal to the nation. That's what Germany said. Like in the Holocaust, France, if you know anything about the Dreyfus affair, that's why Dreyfus was able to be convicted. It's like he's not really loyal to France, despite being a general in the French army. He's only loyal to he's really only loyal to other Jews. So when you say only loyal to Israel, like you're denying, you're reaching into that old trope. The other thing to note here is I'm American. I've lived in the United States my entire life. Israel's a country 6,000 miles away. Like, it's important to me for a variety of reasons, but I'm not Israeli. I have no influence over I have as much influence over their politics as you do. And so to sort of insinuate that somehow I have more influence or more say is problematic. And then just a quick note on BDS. Boycotts of Jewish people by non-Jews have historically been followed by pogroms. So the first step is like, oh my God, the Jews are doing bad things, we need to boycott them. And then 3 weeks later or 3 months later, it's like, and now we're gonna burn down their houses. So many Jews oppose BDS and think it's anti-Semitic because of that history of boycotts against Jewish things. Because Israel's the only Jewish country, it's the like, they're boycotting the Jews. If you're boycotting the Jews, the next thing is the pogrom, and oh my God, because that's our history. So it's important to note with BDS and people who are involved with BDS that you are tapping into this sort of greater power, and that's how a lot of Jews see the work of BDS, because specifically Jewish boycotts have led to that. And so that doesn't mean don't support BDS or whatever. It just means that you need to understand that sort of greater history that you're tapping into when you're thinking about things like BDS. For those who don't know, BDS is Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is a movement that people have done to sort of try and end the occupation. It's Palestinian-led, but it's, yeah. But that understanding of why Jews so vehemently oppose BDS is a lot to do with history and a lot to do with how we think about the world. Cool, questions?
All right, well, I kind of just want to say that this has been really awesome. A couple of comments, and one of the things that you said, Jonathan, is just asking for Jewish folks to give an explanation of Israel's policies and just to take a position. I, as someone who is working in this group of folks who have gathered together to tackle racism, I experienced this myself too, even though I'm not necessarily a Jewish person. Just pointing out anti-Semitism, I immediately was criticized for someone who potentially is not, supporting Palestinians or is not critical of Israel policy towards Palestinians. Believe it or not, I actually, in preparation of this discussion, I had to make a conscious decision. I'm wearing this a scarf, which is very much a symbol for me to kind of like show on what side I'm taking. This is a Palestinian-made, handmade scarf by women in Palestine. And I have experienced it as well, just as being an ally. I wanted to kind of like reiterate this.
Yeah, I something that happens a lot in leftist groups, and this is part of the isolation piece of anti-Semitism, is when a Jew enters the group, the first question toward them is, well, what's your stance on Israel? And it's like, hey, I'm trying to, like, if I'm going to like a Black Lives Matter protest, I'm trying to show up as somebody who's trying to solve racism in the United States. My opinions on a country 6,000 miles away has no bearing on whether I can show up in a United States protest on a United States issue. And so that also can contribute to sort of the isolation that Jews feel from oppressed groups. And so Israel, a lot of the time, sort of acts as that wedge that isolates Jews, and trying to sort of break down that barrier, both in terms of gatekeeping, in terms of letting Jews in, but also, yeah, gatekeeping in terms of letting Jews in, and also just sort of letting Jews be, right? Because you don't necessarily, I can show up for racial politics in the United States, and then I can not show up in in other places. And this also, by the way, helps AstroTurf organizations get hold. So there's another Jewish group that founded shortly after called Zioness, And Zionist was founded by these right-wing folks as a left-wing anti-racist, Jewish anti-racist organization. So they're like, we're Zionist and anti-racist. And again, we're going to get to Zionism in a second, so let's not worry so much about what that can mean. But the point was that that the right had decided that that was a good wedge with which to draw between Jews and oppressed groups, and tried to use that wedge as a means of sort of fracturing what they saw as a growing anti-occupation and greater sort of Jewish leftist movement, most notably in the most notably, like, if not now, really, I would say, but if not now, and the growing influence of JVP.
All right, Jonathan, this is awesome. I will skip questions for now. I just want to get you kind of oriented in the time we're in. I kind of want us to finish this discussion in about 10 to 15 minutes. We have a panelist discussion coming up at 7 p.m. Bulgarian time, 11 a.m. Chicago, 12 New York. So I know we have a couple of more important points to make, so just orienting you in the time.
Let's do it. So this is the final thing, which is Zionism and anti-Semitism. So Zionism has three competing definitions that are important to understand. I want to thank, for this section specifically, this is new stuff for me. There's a Palestinian author who wrote a really great piece in 972 that I immediately took this definition from, quit out of the tab and cannot find, so I don't know his name, and it's very annoying. But he's the one who sort of got me thinking about this. So I want to thank him, even if I can't figure out who he is specifically. So Zionism sort of has three competing definitions. Definition number one is a Jewish movement for self-determination and sovereignty. Definition number two is movement for the establishment and maintenance of a Jewish nation state. Definition number three is a settler colonialist project bent on domination of an indigenous people. And those three definitions create all kinds of tension within Zionism itself, because definition number one is clearly unobjectionable. Nobody can say that there shouldn't be a movement for Jewish self-determination to determine what we want and where we want to do. Definition number two can be objectionable because establishing a nation state is generally a violent process, and maintaining a nation state can also be a violent process. And a nation state that is on land that somebody else already occupies means that you are going to cause tension and with the people already there. But on the same time, like being able to, like Jews deciding Jewish self-determination, saying that we should have our own nation state and trying to make it a reality, isn't necessarily a problem. And then definition number three, which is a settler colonial project, is very clearly objectionable and is terrible. So the thing is, the contrast between these definitions create the tension that debates around Zionism, both within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community, because the question of Zionism is a question of what do you think Zionism means and how do you define Zionism? And those questions are always in tension with each other. And those definitions are always in tension with each other. So the question of how you self-define and how you think about Zionism very much depends on sort of which definition you sort of think is more important in the way that you think about it. And that's sort of the tension that comes around with Zionism. So the other thing to note about Zionism here is not all Zionists are not all Jews are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jews. So If Not Now, for example, defines itself as a non-Zionist movement. We do not take a stand on Zionism, whether for or against. And because of the fact that we take we do not take a stance on Zionism, right? Like a lot of Jews who are non-Zionist or anti-Zionist are within If Not Now. And a lot of people who define themselves as Zionists, either by any of the definitions, are non-Jews. And some of them are actually anti-Semites. So like Donald Trump would probably define himself as a Zionist because he agrees with definition number 3 of Zionism because he's Donald Trump. And so the important thing to note here is that a lot of what that does also is that because Jews tend to be associated with Zionism, there is a sort of trick that a lot of people use, which is they say the word Zionist, and if they replace it with the word Jew, that's anti-Semitic. But they try to do it as sort of a way to get away. So don't let them get away with that trick. And B, don't do it yourselves. So if you say Zionists run the banks, then you're saying something anti-Semitic, because if you just replace it with the word Jew, it's anti-Semitic. So be careful in your language. When talking about Zionism. And if we go back to the chart for a sec, you'll see like this paragraph is a very good thought in terms of how this happens, right? So the first paragraph, right, Zionism has included elements of racism. Major Zionist factions have implemented conscious, intentional racist policies. That is true. Regardless of individual Zionist intentions, Zionism as a whole has had racist and oppressive results for the Palestinian people. All true. But right, the Zionism is racism becomes the way in which the right wing can talk about the Zionist conspiracy, or say Zionists run the banks, or say the Zionists are behind this, or the Zionists control U.S. foreign policy, or all of those things. And that is a way that they can sort of smuggle anti-Semitism into the left wing and smuggle anti-Semitic ideas leftward. So, conclusion. Anti-Semitism is real. It kind of works as an all-ranging conspiracy theory. We need to be vigilant in stopping it. Israel does complicate things, but if we're clear about what's happening, we can stop confusing the two. And please don't replace the word Jew with Zionist.
Yeah, I like this. The few things, I think we're gonna write them down and kind of trying to remember them. This was really great, Jonathan. I think that you touched upon some of the major things that we, been trying to understand. There's a lot of passion when talking about things, and I think this has been well explained in Sartor's piece as well. I think one of the other things that has come with me trying to understand and learn more about some of these dynamics is to really think about anti-Semitism not just as cyclical, but as a dynamic in group relationships, and even kind of like understanding and realizing that some of the anti-communist things that are being discussed and talked about in Bulgaria right now, because there aren't really any communists, and as people say, if there are no Jews, like the anti-Semite will actually make them up. So very similar to this, kind of like, if we don't have any communists in Bulgaria, how is it possible that the communists are responsible for everything? And I think that this learning more about anti-Semitism is helping me understand this, because it is based on that same dynamic of like someone else is running the world and the middle agent. And then going through historical events and things like that, understanding that a lot of the anti-communist movement is actually a movement against Jewish folks as well. So quite interesting there. Either way, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. We do have some more work to do today. We are going to have some amazing panelists coming up in about half an hour. We're going to see Angel, Solomon, Deliana, Milena, and Stoyo, all folks, organizers, agitators, and educators in Bulgaria, or in short, activists. Some really great panelists we have coming up in about half an hour. And with that, I'm going to say that it's time for us to take a little bit of a break and get together technically for the next part of our discussion.